We are now talking to Sports Illustrated NBA reporter and insider Brett Siegel. What's going on, Brett?
Hey, happy to be joining you guys again. How are you good? How are you doing?
We're good, man. I remember the last time you were here, and I absolutely were reading some of your posts and following you on Facebook and seeing what you've been posting on Twitter. Really interesting stuff. And why don't we get into the playoffs and the NBA Finals, which the Celtics, who would have thought the Celtics versus the Golden State Warriors, two very talented teams, one really offensively sounded team, and then another top-end defensive talented team, one of the best defensive teams we've seen in a very, very long time. What are your thoughts after game number one, Golden State having the lead, 10-point lead going into the fourth quarter, choke, giving up a huge lead with 10 minutes left, and really throwing away that game, and then coming back in game number two and shutting down the Boston Celtics?
Yeah, I mean, I look back on game one and looking at the rest of the series and especially how game two played out, I'm surprised it's not Warriors 2-0 right now because they've looked really good defensively at times. The fourth quarter of game one, they did not look good defensively, but they didn't look good at all. They got outscored 40-16 in that fourth quarter. And you just kind of shrug it off if you're the Warriors or a fan of the Warriors, because what are you going to do if Al Horford and Derek White make 11 combined threes? Like, if you had bet on that, you're probably a millionaire right now, just because the chances of it happening are very slim. And we saw it. What happened the next game? Al Horford had 2 points. He had a goose egg going into halftime, I'm pretty sure. And he only made one basket the entire game after scoring 26 points in game one. So I think the story of the finals right now is the lack of consistency that the Boston Celtics have on offense. And they definitely have to be concerned. I mean, you can point to a bunch of different things and say, oh, Jason Tatum necessarily only had one good game and Jaylen Brown has yet to get going. But you look at the opposite side, there's a guy named Klay Thompson that still hasn't gotten going yet for the Warriors. And if he gets going, it's game over because Steph Curry's looking like the finals MVP right now. Jordan Poole finally emerged in game two, looking like the young star that he's growing into be. Andrew Wiggins has been a two-way stud for the Warriors this entire playoff. So, I mean, if you're the Boston Celtics, you definitely have to be concerned with your lack of offensive production from Robert Williams, Marcus Smart, and Al Horford.
So two player of each team that you think is a big X factor based on what you've seen in the first two games of the finals going forward.
Yeah, for the Celtics, it's Jaylen Brown. I mean, you look at the two guys at the top of this series right now. You have Jason Tatum for the Boston Celtics. You have Stephen Curry for the Golden State Warriors. Who's going to be that third guy to really step up in this series and elevate their team? Because whoever takes that third spot, their team's most likely going to win this series. And so far, it's looked like it's been the Warriors. And you could throw a bunch of names into that number two spot. Kevon Looney has had a big impact for them. Andrew Wiggins. I mean, like I said, we still yet to see Klay Thompson really emerge in this series. But for the Celtics, it needs to be Jaylen Brown. He needs to look like the all-star talent that he is. And we saw glimpses of it in the first half of game two. He's got to sustain that for all 48 minutes of games 3 and 4. Because if the Warriors win game 3 tomorrow night on Wednesday, and they go up 2-1 in this series, there's going to be a lot of pressure on the Celtics to defend home court because they have not looked good at home in the playoffs. And if they drop game 4 and the Warriors go back home 3-1, I mean, that you can pretty much put a bow on this series. There's not a chance that the Warriors would blow another 3-1 lead in the NBA Finals. They've learned that lesson the hard way. And against the Celtics, I mean, it's just the lack of offensive production there. Jaylen Brown needs to be better, and they need to be hitting those outside shots that they were hitting in game one to stand a chance, especially in a 6 or 7 game series.
We are talking to Sports Illustrated NBA reporter, insider Brett Siegel. Now, Brett, is there a reason why Jason Tatum, he disappears in certain games? This guy has been one of the best offensive players in the second half of the season. One of the reasons why the Boston Celtics were the number 2 seed going into the playoffs. Throughout the playoffs, he would. There were certain series that he'd just show up and play at the top of his game. And then there were games that he just disappeared. He'd score 12 points here or 15 points here. And he's not the same player that we see throughout the regular season in the second half of the season. Is there a reason why Jason Tatum has not shown up in this series?
Yes, and the reason is Andrew Wiggins. I think Andrew Wiggins has done a really good job of defending him, and it's not just Wiggins either. It's Draymond Green. We've seen multiple times where Draymond Green has switched on to Jason Tatum or Jaylen Brown out on the perimeter, and he's had a great impact in this series so far. The Celtics have had no answers for his defensive intensity, and they've tried to match it on the opposite side of Marcus Smart, but Marcus Smart has gotten into some silly foul trouble, and when he's not making shots offensively, disappears himself. To answer your question with Jason Tatum disappearing, I think it's more of him trying to get others involved involved than it is him just not making shots. I mean, game one, yeah, he wasn't making shots, but game two, we saw what he was fully capable of doing in that first half. It looked like that he was going to go for 30 or 40 points in the game. Ultimately, the Celtics just slowed down on offense and they weren't able to get anything going against Golden State's stout defense in the second half. But Jason Tatum, it's not necessarily him that needs to appear in this series. I mean, you know what you're going to get from Jason Tatum, whether it's him dishing out assists or him scoring. It's those other guys. It's that secondary talent. Like I mentioned, Jaylen Brown needs to get going on offense. Marcus Smart needs to be hitting shots from the perimeter because they just don't match up well with the Warriors on the offensive end of the floor. The Warriors have so many options that they can turn to. And they've picked apart the Celtics defense so far in this series. They've looked good on offense, in my opinion. So it's really going to take a group effort for the Celtics offensively, and they're just really going to have to zone in and knock down some tough shots if they're going to wind up either winning one or both games at home.
So what we've seen from the last two NBA finals, this series and then the Suns-Bucks last year, do you think home growing and then developing around certain stars is the way of the league now? Because we've seen the super team era try to make it work after LeBron did it. And those teams have started to die out. The Lakers struggling this year, the Nets, the Clippers, teams like that really starting to fade. Do you think it'll change the way of the philosophy of the league again?
Yes and no. I think it depends on the market because you look at some teams like the Los Angeles markets, those are really attractive markets year in and year out for free agents. I mean, and the same thing with the New York teams. Brooklyn is going to be a very nice destination for some of these veteran players looking to hunt for championships. Even the Knicks, we've seen them be in the news for some big players in recent years. Maybe they haven't landed one yet, but it's coming. They're going to be landing an all-star type talent or making a trade for another all-star type talent within the next year or two, based on the trajectory of how that organization is going. So I think it's a little bit of who's the franchise, who's the team, and what kind of market are they in? Because a team, and I'm just going to use this as an example, and I'm sure that we can touch on them a little bit because they got a lot of news going on. That's the Utah Jazz. They're a small market team, even though they've improved a lot over the last few years. And what's going on with them right now is a direct result of not being able to attract big name free agents or get those big names in trades. They have Donovan Mitchell, they have Rudy Gobert. Those are homegrown talents that they drafted and that they've produced into all-star type talents. So in an instance like the Jazz, yes, I think they have to build like that only because the market's not there for them to attract the other big names. But you look at teams like the Warriors, the Nets, the Lakers, the Clippers, they're always going to be in the market for big names, and they're always going to be in the championship conversation as long as they have the Kawhi Leonards or the LeBron James or the Stephen Currys in which other players around the league want to play with.
Speaking of the Brooklyn Nets, obviously it's been a huge story right now with Kevin Durant. He's not getting along with team management, and he could opt out of his contract this offseason. He has 3 years left on it. This is his opt-out season. He can opt out and go wherever he wants to go. Nobody has heard from Kevin Durant in the last couple of weeks. He's really just doing what Kevin Durant does, hides, and, if you want to talk to him, you want to see what he does, you got to go check out his Twitter or his 6 or 7 Twitter accounts. Who knows? And then Kyrie Irving has come out and said that he wants a super max contract. He wants $245 million, and the Nets told him to go sit on it, really, because Kyrie Irving, he can't stay healthy, or he's doing something on and off the court that kind of makes you shake your head. What are your thoughts to this Brooklyn Nets team? Obviously, with Kyrie Irving, do the Nets give him that extension? Or do the Nets part ways with him? And what's going on with Kevin Durant? Because nobody's heard from Kevin Durant in the last couple of weeks.
To clarify Kevin Durant's contract situation, he did recently sign that contract extension. Yes. Kevin Durant is under contract through the 2025-26 season, so he is going to be there. The question mark for the Brooklyn Nets right now is Kyrie Irving, because he's the one that has the player option. He can opt out after this year. Or in this offseason and become a free agent unrestricted. And there's no clarity on if the Nets plan to extend him long-term or if he even wants to be in Brooklyn long-term. I mean, it's been a really up and down year for him simply because of the whole New York City vaccine mandates. And we all know Kyrie Irving's stance on it and what happened this season with the Nets. I do think that they're going to want to keep him around because that's what they invested all this money for. They invested for Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving from the start. This was even before they went out and got James Harden. It was going to be Irving and Durant contending for championships. And we really have yet to see them play a full season together since they both signed there. So I think this upcoming year is huge for them, whether he opts into this contract without getting a contract extension in the offseason and just plays the year through before becoming an unrestricted free agent, or whether or not they give him a big deal. I think this is the pivotal year for the Brooklyn Nets where they're going to have Irving, they're going to have Kevin Durant, and most importantly, surprisingly, they're going to have Ben Simmons. And I think that's a really big piece for them simply because Ben Simmons, when he's healthy, is a top 10, top 5 defender in the league simply because he can guard any position 1 through 5, and they can use him in many different roles. I mean, Ben Simmons is a really good ball handler. We all know what he can't do scoring the ball. He can't shoot from outside the paint. But I think Steve Nash and the Nets are really going to put him in a position where he doesn't have to, because he has two of the best scorers in the league next to him, in Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant. Just simply getting them the ball and being a guy that can go and crash the boards on both ends of the floor. He can defend at a high level. I think that's going to be his role, somebody that can run pick and roll sets with Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and it's really going to open up their offense, make them deadly, especially with Seth Curry and Joe Harris, two of the better shooters in the league, out on the perimeter as well. So I really like how the Nets look. It's going to be interesting to see how they surround those guys with talent, and especially if they bring back Bruce Brown, who is going to be a free agent this offseason.
So do you think it's realistic for them to be able to improve any more with the lack of draft picks that they have and really the depth that has been an issue for them in the past? And if the answer is no to that, what do you think the Nets ceiling is if everything goes to the best case scenario of Kyrie actually playing games and Kevin Durant staying healthy?
Well, the best case scenario is reaching the NBA Finals, and I think that's definitely capable for them as long as those three All-Stars stay healthy. They obviously need to get some bench depth. That's going to be a main concern for them, and they need to add some front court help because their front court was a mess with guys rotating in and out this year due to injury. But you look at the core of this roster with the guys I mentioned before, all healthy: Ben Simmons, Seth Curry, Joe Harris, Kevin Durant, and Kyrie Irving. Right there, that's a championship starting five, in my opinion. I think it's very well balanced. I think that defensively, maybe it's a little bit of a liability, but if you can outscore the other team, I mean, you don't really need defense in that situation. So, and to answer your first question you asked of how they can fill out the rest of the roster and how the rest of this team will look, I think that it is an attractive market for them to improve. They're in a really good area in New York. It's one of arguably the biggest market in professional sports. And because you have Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, you're going to see a lot of these veteran players that are available on the market want to go there and play there because they see it as a championship contending team, much like we saw with the Lakers ahead of this season. Obviously, they weren't a championship contending team this year, but a lot of those veteran guys wanted to join that team, and they turned down some veterans to sign different ones. So I think that the Nets will have a good market. It will be interesting to see how they handle their cap situation because they are going to be a tax-paying team. And looking forward, the outlook of this franchise 2, 3, 4 years from now really depends on the 2022-23 season and whether or not they can prove that they can contend for a title. Because if they go to the playoffs again, lose in the first or second round, I think you may see them try to take the franchise in a different direction, especially if they don't tie themselves down to a long-term contract with Irving.
Yeah, Mr. Marshall will be looking for a new job because he traded away their future, just like our old little friend over there before him. So we've seen this before. King did it, and that's why King doesn't have a job. And Sean Marks might not have a job if this team doesn't figure things out because he traded away their future for James Harden. James Harden's now playing for Philadelphia. And you bring in Ben Simmons. Ben Simmons has not been a likable player throughout the league, as you know what Doc Rivers has said about him when it comes to practices. And then you've heard some of the players that played with him don't really like him either. So we'll see what he does with Brooklyn.